Hello and welcome to this SOFiSTiK tutorial about parametrization using secondary axes in the SOFiSTiK Bridge and Infrastructure Modeler. In this video, I will show you how to create families optimized for using the secondary axis references with the SOFiSTiK Bridge and Infrastructure Modeler. Let's start by explaining what is a secondary axis. A secondary axis is an axis that follows the main geometry of the host axis. So this is the axis that you see in blue with the placements along the stationing of the axis. By the way, you can also hide the placements that are placed along the stationing. In the settings of the main axis, you can then extend information to add additional, here in red, secondary axes that follow the geometry of the main axis, but can also consider specific offsets horizontally and vertically, as well as incorporate variables for these offsets and they can be used as references for your SOFiSTiK Bridge and Infrastructure Modeler families that can be placed along these references. For example, here you can see a continuous superstructure, but you can also combine different functionalities like cross members that allow you to place specific geometries in an interval, still referencing the secondary axis. So the question is how to prepare a Revit family to reference the secondary axis properly. We start by creating an adaptive point in the family. The references that we then create are simply additional reference points. These can have an offset in U, horizontal, and V, vertical direction. In this case, vertical is 0. And then we can select the reference point to change it into a shape handle point and specifically assign a name to it. This is very important as this can be later referenced via the SOFiSTiK Bridge and Infrastructure Modeler. The defined offset here actually doesn't matter at all. This shape handle point simply lets us reference a secondary axis in a three-dimensional system and puts the point there. The original adaptive point will still be referenced to the main axis that is used to create this family. Let's also consider a second shape handle point. This point will once more represent a secondary axis that we will select later in the three-dimensional system and will consider a horizontal and vertical offset from the adaptive point which is referring the main axis. Once more, shape handle point must be changed and a name must be assigned. When we finished assigning the shape handle points, we can, as usual in a Revit family, create additional reference points that we can use for a geometry in our Revit family. In this case, a two-dimensional reference for a superstructure controlled by splines. In our project with our main axis, the blue one, and our two secondary axes, this family will then be placed by the SOFiSTiK Bridge and Infrastructure Modeler in reference to the stationing. So here you can see the rectangle as it's going to be placed, and then it can, in this case as a superstructure, be swept along the varying secondary axis to create a volumetric geometry in your project. Let's take a closer look at the workflow in Revit. I start by creating a new project based on the construction template. In here, I switch to a 3D view simply to see the axis better, and I go to the SOFiSTiK Bridge and Infrastructure Modeler to create a new standard axis. I can also already start by disabling the creation of the placement representation in the placements drop-down and click on OK. By moving it in 3D, I now see my main axis in blue here. I can go to Modify or Edit Axis, and in the drop-downs up here you can find variables as well as secondary axis. Here I will use this drop-down to create a new secondary axis. This one I will call left underline 1. Don't forget to click plus to create this axis. Down here you can find that the horizontal and the vertical offset is predetermined at the placement stations with a value of 0. The first axis that I want to create in the top view with an horizontal offset is with an offset of 3 meters. I simply select the first and last placement, and by holding the left mouse button I select the middle ones to delete them. You can see that the start and end definition are enough to create the horizontal offset. By clicking OK, the secondary axis in red is created. Now we are ready to create a new family to use it as a reference for our secondary axis. I want to create a superstructure, so I use generic model adaptive. I move from left to right as these two-dimensional superstructure families are created in this plane over here. And I create a new reference point in the horizontal plane, align it to my center of this family, select it and click on Make Adaptive. This is now our reference for our main axis. To create the reference to the secondary axis, we need to create shape handle points. To do so, I select the right work plane, which is the vertical work plane from left to right, keep in mind. And in here I can select any kind of reference point by creating a new point element. You can now select this reference point and change its point type from reference point to shape handle point. You can immediately see that the reference planes are permanently visible for this point, simply to easier find it. You can of course change this later as well, but what you need to change to use it properly for the SOFiSTiK Bridge and Infrastructure Modeler is to give it a name. This is gonna be my left underline bot reference. Just to quickly showcase what you can do with these reference planes, I select its very vertical reference plane to quickly create easy, simple rectangle at its origin. And I could now use these two references, so the adaptive insertion point along our main axis, as well as the orthogonal to this point stationed longitudinal reference for the secondary axis. Keep in mind before you load this family into your project to give it a type name, in this case type 1, and to save the family to give it a proper name in your project. In this case I want to call it superstructure reference. And I quickly save it on my desktop. Now I will load it into my project. Select the SOFiSTiK Bridge Superstructure tool, create, and select your main axis. You can find the family that we just created in here, superstructure reference type 1, and you can find the one parameter that we assigned as a name is already predetermined as an axis reference. In axis ID you can see that no secondary axis is selected for now. You can either use the drop down to select the A underline left 1 axis, or select this green button over here to select either a curve element or an axis element. So keep in mind to use the tab key to select the secondary axis properly and press enter. You can also see that A1 left is selected. By clicking OK, the program will now sweep this two-dimensional superstructure family along the axis. Here you can see that it is referencing the two-dimensional secondary axis that we created. You can easier see it when you change the view type to wireframe. And here you can see the perfectly aligned rectangle. Let's go to the SOFiSTiK Bridge user interface infra browser, which will show up once you selected it. Here you can see axis A has a secondary axis, left one, as well as a superstructure. which is called component A P0 to P3. In here you can click on Edit Profile Family. This will bring you back to your original family that we created. I now want to get rid of this rectangle, and instead I want to create in this plane a second point. This second point, again placed from left to right in this vertical plane, should be our second shape handle point with the name of left underline top, meaning our top reference to another secondary axis. Now it's an easy task of creating points that are following on the one hand this shape handle point and this shape handle point. So to do so, I select the longitudinal plane of the first point. I create two reference points in this plane. By the way, this will give us a warning that 2 points are at the same place. This is legit warnings. I click on OK and ignore it. I set the bottom point as my reference and once more place 2 reference points in here. You can now, via clicking the Tab key, select these points and drag them by using the green origin coordinate system to drag them apart from its origin point. And you can see that the offset, if you selected the plane, is calculated orthogonal to the plane, and you can give it a fixed value. For example, these 2 points, I want them to have a negative offset of 250, and these two should have a positive offset of 250. You can see now that both these points are following this one shape handle point, which gives us a free definition in the two-dimensional family for a specific part of the geometry. Select these reference points, always 2 of them, do not select the shape handle, and click on Spline Through Points. By doing so, we can create the two-dimensional reference that we use for the superstructure command in the SOFiSTiK Bridge and Infrastructure Modeler. And this will later be swept along our geometry. Keep in mind, it doesn't matter where you place your shape handle points, as long as they are in the right plane. And I will update my project accordingly. The bottom reference will still be the same, and the top one will look a little bit funky because, well, it doesn't have a reference yet. But we will fix that in our process now, because we want to have a bottom and a top reference for our family. To do so, select your main axis to create a secondary axis, which I will call left underline 2. I want the horizontal offset to once again be 3000, so 3000 millimeters. And this time I also want this, a secondary axis, to have a vertical offset where I will start with 2000. I will go up to 5000, come back to 2000 and go up to all the way to 7000. You can see that the transition between those points is set to polygonal. You can change this, for example, to showcase a continuous change in the angle, to have a transition to the left. So here you can see that this point now has a continuous transition to the left of its point. You could change it to a continuous transition to the right, or if you want to define a high point, a transition left and right. I do the same thing for the low point over here to get a very complex height development displayed as a simple line in reference to our main axis, meaning our secondary axis. In the project browser, we can select the component that we created beforehand and edit it. The program now has recognized the additional parameter that we selected for the bottom and top point. You can also see that they are highlighted by clicking on them. And my top point reference is still selected with none. I can now go into the dropdown, select the proper axis, and click on OK. The SOFiSTiK Bridge and Infrastructure Modeler now creates a perfectly aligned sweep along your secondary axis. Maybe a little add-on in the end over here. We can of course also connect variables to control our secondary axis. This can be done very easily. For example, I can create a new parameter called offset. I click on OK. And I now created points that are defined along the stationing. I get rid of them, set them to 4000, 4000. Unit type length. And I can use these variables to control my secondary axis. So I can go to secondary axis, and now I want the horizontal offset of both left 1 and left 2 to be controlled not via points but via a script. By clicking on the formula, you can see here an interface that can be fed with C# programming code, and you can see here #S is the stationing value, so you can do complex operations in here, but you can also just simply select #offset, click on evaluate, and check if the formula is proper. Now the #offset is controlling the horizontal displacement of the secondary axis. You can see here 4000 is displayed. I can do the same for left 2. Change it to #offset. Click on OK. And now to change the offset, which is horizontally defined, I can simply go to my offset parameter, change it for example to 5 meters, to instantly update all the secondary axes that are defined via this variable. Everything that is then attached to the secondary axis will be updated as well, meaning that the geometry of our created sweep along the secondary axis will be updated too.